So let's look at some examples of artwork and analyze them in terms of which of these sources of light do they use, what category do they fall into, are they hybrids, are they fall very much into one specific type. We've already looked at Rembrandt, very much in classical lighting style. This is very much in the classical lighting style. There's very little color bounce. There's very little color at all. It's almost a black and white drawing with some local values in there. So I reinterpreted it as maybe a hybrid 19th century impressionist might. So look at this head where the shaded side is facing the sky. It's bluer down here. That's a little bit warmer. Bottom plane here is greener because of all this green. This is facing up in shadow, so it's getting cool. It should probably be a lot lighter. Look at the shadow of this head, whereas here it's simply modulated light to dark with very little color shift. And here there's a strong difference in local color. It's not local color, but there's a big difference between lit side and shaded side in terms of color. Same thing in here. The shaded side are retaining the color that you would probably actually see if you were there. I doubt if you were really looking at this, would it look like that? So this is an attempt to reinterpret a classical subject in a modified impressionist 19th century style. This is, well, you can see it's 1932, and you can see the effects of impressionism, but also it's kind of a high-keyed classical lighting, but with a bit of HDR thrown in. Now, there's something about HDR that I haven't quite gone over yet, and that is when you start throwing huge amounts of light around, there's very little to distort what colors actually are, the local value and color of something. Let's increase the light levels here. There, and then there. So there's very little difference between shaded side and lit side now. I mean, there's some, but this is kind of a overexposed look. But if you were to paint different local values, like say, for instance, the color of the iris, the color of the eyebrows, the eyelashes, they would be very close to what their actual color is, almost like putting it in a light box, because that's kind of what a light box is you want light coming in from every direction so that you see as clearly as possible what something's true color is. It's an interesting effect, like this. In a way, you could look at this style of working and think that it's kind of along those lines, where you simply have shapes, but there's not much modeling inside the shapes. They're really very flat, and light is hitting it everywhere. The shadows are gone. Everything retains its natural local color and value. So let's look at another example of HDR lighting. You could say that this is because it's using some blacks. It's not truly Impressionism, it's modified Impressionism, but to me what really makes it Impressionism, how I look at it, is this type of HDR lighting, where there is no dark shadows. The shadows are held back to only a few places, and then local color and value are respected in terms of these shapes. The shapes have an integrity because of almost a flat color. This is another example where this white dress, there's very little modeling in here, and there's very little modeling in this outside shape too. There's light literally coming in from everywhere, and you see the difference between dress and skin, because skin is much darker in this world. And all of these characters are in deep shadow. And you kind of think like, well, I wonder how Rembrandt would have thought of this type of lighting. It's really quite interesting. But if this scene were being photographed today, you could bracket the exposures and get a similar kind of effect that Sorolla has gotten here. But one thing you have to realize is kind of a tricky thing about this style of lighting is how flat these larger areas are. As soon as you start trying to model some of this, pretty soon you're going to lose this shape to that shape. So it relies on the integrity of these areas of local value and then staying flat within inside of them, not really modeling a whole lot. So we were looking at this one a minute ago, and you can see how the integrity of the human figure is made by keeping it fairly flat. There's a lot of modeling, a lot of very subtle temperature and saturation changes and color changes, but the overall silhouette is unbroken. The same thing back here, the same thing back there, and there's light coming in from everywhere. There really is no area that's going flat and dark. So light is coming into this scene and bouncing a million times everywhere. It kind of gives a wrap. And it is kind of an interesting interpretation of this because, how this would have been handled very differently in Rembrandt's time. I can just see this being lit with a strong cast shadow and very dark, and this character just seeing a little bit of reflected light, but all this being lost into the background and very, very dark. And this character probably getting some dramatic reflected light off this character, maybe a cast shadow across here. That's one of those things that you kind of have to think to yourself is, what type of art do you want to do? This could be made very, very dramatic given the Rembrandt treatment, the classical lighting treatment, but also look at how beautiful the detail and the color and the volumes that are achieved by careful rendering of local value and using the ideas of HDR lighting and impressionist lighting to bring out the color of all this. Some people would say, well, this flattens things out. You really do need to put that contrast in to get a really strong, well, forgive me, but this would be across there, and then this would all go into shadow. Something like that. And then this back here would just be gone. And same thing there. So you get this really strong graphic feeling to it. It's already looking a bit more Rembrandt-y. So if you were to look at this from across the room, would you be more attracted to it? Is it aesthetically what you're after? To me, that's the whole point of this lesson, is I want you to make conscious choices about the type of lighting that you use and the range of contrasts, and not rely on, okay, how bright should my shadows be? How bright should the lit side be? And write that down in a notebook, and that's the way it is. You can see from all these different examples, like from this to this to this, how they all modulate what's in shadow and redefine what is in shadow and how you handle shadows for very interesting effects. Let's look at another couple images that are really very surprising. So you might look at this and say, is that HDR lighting? Well, I suppose it kind of is, because there is no light and shadow here. It's all shape, and it's all local color and all value. Now, it reads very well because the shapes are precisely drawn and quite accurate, but there really is no lighting on it. This house is, as characteristic of HDR lighting, this house is what it is color-wise. The roof is that. This is green. This is gray. Just a slight bit of modeling here and there. So the colors that you're seeing and the values that you're seeing are the colors and values of what those objects really are. Say this one too. Kiefer drawing. There's no lighting, there's no volume to it at all. Light is coming from every direction, and the only thing that's showing any depth at all is the pattern of the drawing. But clearly, naturalistic dimensional lighting is not what this artist was after. It's fine with me. I think it's fascinating. That different people can ignore these things that we're all taught in art school with stunning effect. And me, this is a stunning image, and completely blows out of the water any ideas about naturalistic lighting and value. If you look at Egon Schiele, who was very much influenced by Klimt, and they were contemporaries, he does kind of the same thing where there is no lit and shaded side. There's no interpretation of light and shadow. It's all shape and texture and local value and color. I think that this was either a conscious or unconscious reaction against highly finished academic painting that had preceded them in the past 80 years before they were around. People getting out a blender brush and spending 3 weeks rendering every single little form and a figure. The fetish with finish, I think this was a reaction against that. But also it's quite flat, so it's decorative. HDR can tend to look a little flat. It turns into a texture almost, and sometimes it can almost be difficult to find what's going on because you don't have that overall organizing aspect of classical lighting. Like, in here, this would be very easy to tell what's going on from across the room. This is somewhat flatter, but to my eye, it's more interesting. It draws me. I want to go look at this more than if it had tons of black in it. And I know that in industrial rendering, I was always taught that contrast is your best friend. And I don't agree with that idea. I think that the human eye and mind are more sophisticated than that and are attracted to something that is more real than simply contrast. They're really attuned to seeing the shapes of faces. I see this just fine. So it's a matter of personal taste.